I met my husband at a folk music festival in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, in the summer of 1987. I was 33 years old, working as a registered nurse at the Queen Elizabeth II Health Sciences Centre in Halifax, and I thought I had a pretty good sense of who I was and what I wanted from life. He was standing near the lobster boil with a paper plate and a shy smile, and he had the kind of quiet that felt like depth rather than emptiness. His name was Thierry. He was Quebecois from a big family in Rimouski, and he spoke with an accent that made English sound like it had rounded edges. We dated for 2 years before we married. His mother flew in from Rimouski for the wedding, a small woman with dark eyes who kissed me on both cheeks and called me cher. I thought it meant she liked me. I believed a lot of things in those early years that turned out to be something else entirely. Thierry worked in marine engineering. His contracts took him to Vancouver sometimes, to St. John's, once to Rotterdam for 8 months. I kept working at the hospital through the early years of our marriage, nights mostly, because nights paid more and we were trying to save for a house. We bought a place in Bedford in 1994, a colonial with blue shutters and a yard that backed onto a small creek. I planted a kitchen garden. I learned to make tourtière at Christmas because it mattered to him. I tried, in every way I knew how, to fold myself into the shape of what he needed. What I didn't understand then, what took me far too long to understand, was that the shape kept changing, and the more I tried to fit it, the less I could find myself inside it. His mother visited every summer, 2 or 3 weeks at a time. She and Terry would sit at the kitchen table after dinner and talk for hours. I would clear the dishes, make tea, bring out whatever I'd baked that afternoon, and they would talk. In French. Not a word to include me, not a glance to acknowledge I was still in the room. I told myself it was natural. French was his first language. She was his mother. Of course they fell into it. I spoke no French when we married. A bit of high school French, really. Bonjour, merci, où est la bibliothèque? The kind that vanishes within a year of not using it. So for a long time, those dinner table conversations would just sound to me, a kind of music I couldn't read. Thierry never translated. If I asked later what they'd been talking about, he'd shrug. Family stuff, he'd say. Nothing you'd find interesting. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative, that he was actively choosing to keep me out, was something I wasn't ready to look at directly. The first time I wondered if something was wrong, truly wrong, was the summer our daughter was 7. She came inside from the backyard while my mother-in-law was visiting and asked me why Grandmaman had called me La Froide, cold one. She'd heard it at the kitchen table and wanted to know what it meant, because it had something to do with me. She could tell from the way they'd look toward the window when they said it. I told her it probably meant something else, that French words were tricky. I tucked her into bed that night and lay awake for a long time listening to Thierry breathing beside me. The next morning, I made crepes for breakfast because his mother loved crepes, and I smiled when she thanked me, and I didn't say a word. But something had shifted, something quiet and irreversible, the way a hairline crack appears in a foundation wall. And you know, even if you don't say it, that the house is no longer quite what it was. I started listening differently after that, not to the meaning, I still couldn't follow the French, but to the tone, the pauses, the way his mother's voice dropped when she glanced toward wherever I was standing, the way Thierry would sometimes laugh at something, and then, when I looked up, the laugh would stop. For years I told myself I was imagining it. Thierry was not unkind in the ways people think of when they think of unkind. He didn't shout. He didn't call me names in English. He was simply absent in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. He handled all the finances because he'd always done it, and I'd let him early on because he was meticulous, and I was working long shifts and it seemed like an easy division of labour. He paid the bills, managed the investments, kept the joint account. He gave me a monthly household allowance transferred to a separate account in my name for groceries and personal expenses. It felt practical when we set it up. By the time I understood what it actually was, we had been doing it for over 20 years. I couldn't have told you when I first thought about learning French. It came on slowly, the way most important decisions do. Our daughter had started university in Montreal. She wanted to be bilingual, she said. She wanted real French, and she'd phone home and slip into French with her father, and I'd sit across the table listening to the two of them laugh at something I couldn't reach. One evening after she'd hung up, I asked Thierry if he'd ever thought about taking a French class together as a couple. He looked at me the way you look at someone who said something slightly ridiculous. "You're 60 years old," he said. "What would be the point?" I signed up for a beginner's course at the continuing education office at Dalhousie 3 days later. I told him I joined a book club. I'm not proud of the lie, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I needed the protection of it. I knew, without being able to articulate exactly why, that if he knew I was learning French, something would close off, some door would shut, and I needed that door open. The class met Tuesday evenings. The instructor was a patient woman from Moncton who had this quality of making you feel that the language was something you were remembering rather than acquiring for the first time. I was the oldest in the class by at least 15 years. I didn't care. I did my exercises at the kitchen table after Thierry went to bed, with the volume turned low on the audio tracks. I labelled things in the house with small post-it notes that I took down before he woke up. I was diligent in a way I hadn't been about anything in years, and I understood slowly that the diligence itself was telling me something. It took 2 years before I could follow a conversation in real time. Not perfectly. There were still words I'd miss, idioms that slipped past me, but well enough for what was coming, though I didn't know yet what that was. His mother's health had been declining. She'd had a hip replacement the previous winter, and her doctor in Rimouski wanted her closer to family. Thierry had been talking vaguely about whether she might come to stay with us for a while. I said, of course, whatever he needed, which is what I always said. She arrived in March of that year. Late March, when Halifax still has that raw edge to it, grey skies and the smell of the ocean going cold. She was smaller than I remembered. Slower, but her eyes were the same, sharp and watchful and always slightly assessing me, the way I now understood they always had been. The first week was ordinary enough. I cooked, I helped her with her exercises, I drove her to a specialist appointment at the VG site. She thanked me. Thierry thanked me. We were all very polite. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into her stay. I'd gotten home from picking up groceries and I could hear them in the sitting room before I'd even taken off my coat. The conversation was fast and low and I almost walked in immediately, but something made me stop in the hallway, bags still in my hands. I stood there and I listened. She was asking about the house, specifically about what would happen to the house. Thierry's voice was careful in the way it got when he was saying something he didn't want to examine too closely. I knew that register in him, even in French. He said the house was in both names. Legally, he couldn't just... And she interrupted him. She said something about the RSPs, about an account in Moncton she hadn't known about. She used a word I had to place for a moment, and then it landed. Cachets. Hidden. She asked if I knew. He said no. She said good. She said it had been 20 years of careful planning, and the last thing needed now was for me to start understanding what I'd never bothered to learn. She said it without cruelty, the way you state a fact. She said my name the way people say the name of something they've decided doesn't require much consideration. I set the grocery bags down on the floor of the hallway, very carefully. I didn't want them to hear the rustle of plastic. I stood there for another minute, and then I walked into the kitchen the long way, through the back hall, and I put the kettle on. And I stood at the window looking at the creek, and I thought, so that's what it is. Not betrayal, exactly, or not only that. What I felt in that moment was the particular grief of confirmation. When you've known something in your body for years and finally your mind catches up, the numbness of it, the strange relief of it. I didn't react that evening. I made dinner. I carried her tea to the sitting room. I said good night and went to bed before Thierry did, and I lay in the dark thinking with a clarity I hadn't had in a very long time. I called a lawyer the following week. Her office was on Barrington Street, a small firm that specialised in family law, and she had one of those voices that's both businesslike and kind at the same time. The kind of voice that tells you she has heard this kind of story before and that she does not find it surprising. I told her about the account in Moncton. I told her about the monthly allowance structure that had kept me financially dependent for 22 years. I told her I had very little understanding of our actual financial picture because it had never been put in front of me. She told me what my rights were under Nova Scotia's Matrimonial Property Act. She told me that a long-term marriage, in law, creates an equal claim to family assets, regardless of whose name they're in or who manage them. She told me to get a copy of our most recent tax returns, which I had a legal right to as a joint filer. She told me other things too, practical things, and I wrote them down in a notebook I kept in my car. I want to say that I was calm through all of this. I wasn't entirely. There were mornings I woke up at 4 and lay there with my chest so tight I had to remind myself to breathe. There were evenings when I cooked dinner and watched him eat it and felt the strangeness of sitting across from someone you have slept beside for 35 years and understanding that the version of the marriage you believed in was not the one he was living. But there was also something else, something I hadn't expected, a kind of steadiness that came from finally knowing, from having stopped pretending not to notice, from being, at 63 years old, entirely done with making myself smaller than I was. I told him I wanted a divorce on a Sunday morning in April. His mother had gone back to Rimouski 2 weeks earlier. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the newspaper, and I sat down across from him and I said it clearly, in English. And then, because I wanted him to understand that I understood, I said it again in French. He looked at me for a long time, then he asked when I'd learned French. I told him I'd been learning for 3 years. He asked what else I knew. I told him enough. The process took 14 months. There were complications, as there always are after a marriage of that length. The house, the pension, the Moncton account, which did indeed exist, and which the courts treated as a family asset. My lawyer was good. I was patient. I had learned, in 35 years of marriage, how to wait. Our daughter was the hardest part, not because she took sides. She didn't, not exactly, but because watching her try to hold both of us at once was one of the more painful things I've witnessed as a parent. She flew home from Montreal twice during the proceedings. The second time she sat with me in the kitchen and cried and said she didn't understand how this had happened, how she hadn't seen it. I told her it wasn't something she was meant to see. It was something I'd spent 30 years not seeing myself. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the south end of Halifax the following spring. The second bedroom I turned into a sitting room with a reading chair and a lamp and a window that faces east. And in the mornings I have my coffee there and watch the light come in, and I don't feel, most days, the particular loneliness I expected to feel. I still speak French, though I'm far from fluent. I listen to Radio Canada sometimes in the evenings, more for the company of it than for any practical purpose. My daughter thinks it's funny. She'll call and we'll practice together, her correcting my accent, me pretending to be insulted, both of us laughing. It's not the life I planned at 33, standing near the lobster boil with a paper plate, thinking I understood what depth looked like. But it's mine, fully and without apology for maybe the first time. Someone asked me recently, a woman from my Tuesday French class, we've stayed in touch, she asked if I regretted not leaving sooner. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said I wasn't sure regret was quite the right word. What I regret is the version of myself who believed that making herself undemanding was the same as being loved. What I don't regret is the Tuesday evenings at Dalhousie, the post-it notes taken down before dawn, the 3 years of learning something in secret that turned out to be the most important thing I ever did. The cage felt real for a very long time. The door had been there the whole while. There's a moment I keep coming back to, standing in that hallway with the grocery bag still in my hands, listening to my husband tell his mother that the last thing needed was for me to start understanding what I'd never bothered to learn. He said it without anger. That was the part that stayed with me longest. He said it the way you state something you've already decided is simply true. I think about what it took to get to that hallway. Not courage exactly, not at first. Just a kind of quiet stubbornness. The Tuesday evenings at Dalhousie, the post-it notes I took down before dawn, the 3 years of doing something in secret that I was slightly embarrassed to want. I hadn't been dishonest in my marriage, not ever. And the small deception of the book club sat uneasily with me even then. But I understood, even before I could name it clearly, that there are situations where protecting yourself is the only honest thing left to do. That's the thing about integrity. And I mean real integrity, the kind that lives in your bones rather than in how you appear to others. It sometimes asks you to act from values that nobody else can see yet. For 3 years, I showed up to that classroom and practiced verb conjugations and felt foolish and kept going anyway. Not because I knew what I was building toward, because something in me had decided that I deserved to understand my own life. The financial dependence was the part I found hardest to examine honestly because it required admitting my own role in it. I had let it happen. Not entirely. There was a structure in place long before I understood its purpose, but I had signed forms without reading them, accepted the monthly transfers without asking questions, told myself that trust was the same as knowledge. It wasn't. Wisdom, I think, is knowing the difference between the two. And wisdom tends to arrive late, in hallways with grocery bags in your hands. What I found at 63 was not something I expected to find at 63. I found that I was still capable of beginning, of sitting in a classroom as the oldest person by 15 years and not letting embarrassment win, of calling a lawyer and writing things down in a notebook, kept in the car, of holding myself together through 14 months of legal proceedings, while also learning how to make my own decisions about money for what felt like the first time in my adult life. None of that was graceful. Most of it was just getting through the next week. But there's a kind of strength in that too, the unglamorous, ordinary kind that doesn't look like strength from the outside and feels from the inside like simply refusing to stop. Thierry was not a monster. That matters to say. He was a man who had built a life that suited him and had quietly made sure the architecture of it kept me in a particular place. The harm in that is real. And so is the fact that I spent too many years not asking the questions I should have asked. We both made choices that added up to something neither of us should be proud of. I'm not interested in punishing him for his part in it. I am interested in not repeating my part in it. The cage felt real for a very long time. That's what I'd want someone to hear. If they're sitting somewhere right now, feeling like the walls are fixed and permanent. The door was there the whole time. I just needed to learn a language first.